In this video we have an organizational video, one that I've had trouble getting information on, so it's one that I kept coming back to occasionally. I have enough information now that I think I can do a halfway decent video on this. It's still not up to standard of what I've done in the other ones, but this is what I can get a hold of by looking at free online information. I looked at a few videos on this, and I also looked up a few World War I historical sites. Now, this video, as you can see at the top there, is on World War I German Stosstruppen, or stormtroops, or shock troops. Now, ideally, there was supposed to be one battalion per division in the German Imperial Army. But there's no guarantee that they met that final goal. From what I've been able to find out, the first German stormtroops started being employed around 1915, 1916 time frame, and the organization changed and the tactics changed through the war up through 1918, where they were used quite heavily during the German spring offensive of 1918 called the Kaiserschlacht. Now, one thing I kept coming across was there was no one set organization that every battalion went off of. They kind of modified it according to what was available in the area and the anticipated needs by the parent unit, by that division. Standards early in the war were very high for the people they looked for to be stormtroopers, and by the end of the war a lot of those standards had slacked off quite a bit. In the beginning they had to be no more than 25 years of age, if I remember correctly, no families, they had to be fearless across the board, no hesitation in what they did. But by the end of the war that started to change. Now, in a standard battalion, there was approximately 3 to 4 infantry companies, and these were not the same size as a standard German infantry company. These were typically smaller. There was one machine gun company, which reportedly in the very beginning was equipped primarily with MG08s, tripod mounted heavy machine guns. But as the war progressed, they started using more light machine guns. So MG08 15s, Danish Matson machine guns, and also captured British Lewis guns. Basically, they kept lightening the load as much as they could on weapons as the war went along. Now, I came across that there is supposed to have been one trench mortar company and one light artillery battery. The trench mortar company had quote-unquote light mortars, but the mortars that they had probably weighed about as much as an 81 millimeter or even a 120 millimeter mortar does nowadays. So that's kind of relative. For size of the mortars, it looks like it was anywhere from a 50 to approximately a 70 to 80 millimeter type mortar. Some of these were moved around on wheeled carriages. So like I said, the term light mortar is just relative for the time period. Now, the light artillery battery had 4 light howitzers or light cannons, and they ranged in size from 75 millimeter to 77 millimeter. Each battalion used what they could get a hold of. If they had captured French 75 millimeters, that's what they used. If they had captured Russian 76.2 millimeters, that's what they used. By the end of the war, apparently most Stosstruppen Abteilung, shock troop battalions or stormtrooper battalions, were equipped with German 77 millimeters. Now, not all battalions had this, but there was also reference that many of them had a flamethrower section. Now, the infantry companies that were the heart of the battalion had 3 platoons, and each platoon was made up of 4 squads. Each squad had 1 NCO and 6 to 8 men. This made them considerably smaller than their counterparts in the standard infantry company in the German army. The average German stormtrooper carried for weapons a Gewehr 98A, which was a carbine version of the Gewehr 98. There was limited numbers of MP-18 submachine guns, which did not reach the front lines till 1918, obviously. And I came across more than one reference that said so few of them made it to the stormtroops that really they really made no influence whatsoever in the battles. There's been more influence attached to it by historians and military enthusiasts than what actual organizations and reports indicate from the time. A weapon that was carried more than even the carbines on the raiding teams was pistols, whatever they could get a hold of, and those could be P08 Lugers with extended magazines. They had drum magazines that they used on the Luger. Those magazines would also get used over on the MP-18 because they used the same magazines. They would also use the German Mauser C96 pistols, but basically whatever pistol they could get a hold of. They would use whatever type of melee weapons they could carry with them. So you'll see pictures of them carrying multiple knives. You'll see them with their entrenching tools shoved inside their belts, different types of war clubs they made. But something that was pretty much a standard was lots and lots of grenades. Each stormtrooper, when he went into battle, carried a huge amount of ammunition and a huge amount of grenades. Now, they used primarily 2 different types of grenades. They used the stick grenade, the potato masher, which everyone knows of from movies and all that stuff. The stick grenade was a blast type grenade or a concussion grenade for use inside trenches. It did not produce much fragmentation, so it reduced the injuries to the stormtroops that were inside the trench when the blast went off. But typically they would throw the stick grenade into the trench, and then right after it blew up, the stormtroops jumped inside. They also used what are referred to as egg grenades. These are smaller handheld grenades which were a fragmentation type, and those were used against machine gun positions and tossed inside bunkers, inside the dugouts, where the enemy troops were sleeping or staying at the time. Now, they did use large bundles of grenades based around the stick grenade, where they would take a single stick grenade and they would tie 6 heads from other grenades around that one, and they would toss those into trenches also to get a little bit extra bang for clearing out larger groups and stuff, or potentially for destruction of equipment. Now, how their operations typically worked. First, they did a lot of reconnaissance. They got as much information of the enemy trench as they could. They then brought it back and it was all collated and that stuff put together from the different teams. Just like with any reconnaissance, these teams would move forward to the enemy trench as close as they could get, look inside, listen, write out strip maps, all that on the enemy trench. Once the information was brought back, it was poured over to figure out where the weak point was in the enemy's line. Was there one particular unit that was asleep on duty? Their guards were, for the most part, fallen asleep instead of being on guard duty. Maybe their machine guns and other weapons were not placed correctly, so there were huge gaps that could be exploited. It was not uncommon, and it was encouraged, that a full-scale terrain model be created of the breach point behind German lines that the stormtroops would train on, so that they would recognize in the dark what they're supposed to do, what's the terrain going to look like, so that they know they turn this direction and not that direction. When the attacks would go in, they would move in small groups, which were widely spread out on the battlefield, and they would move up silently. This was different than the standard infantry tactics where they were massed together, especially early in the war where everyone was marching forward online. There was no pre-raid or pre-attack barrage that was done by the artillery. Early in the war, you had barrages where it would last a few days, maybe a few weeks, of just constantly pounding the enemy trenches. And all that did is push the enemy troops into the dugouts. They would stay out of the trenches unless they absolutely had to. Later in the war, they did more of a targeted barrage where it would come not long before the assault, and then the infantry would push through. Now, did they have some attacks where they would put a quick barrage on a particular location? Yes, that did happen. Now, depending on the mission, depended on what happened here. The infantry would move forward, and then close behind them would be the machine guns, especially the light machine guns. And then behind them would be your light mortar teams. The light artillery battery, at least in the beginning, I came across the tactic was they were supposed to move the light artillery piece right behind the stormtroops through no man's land, which turned out to be pretty much a disaster. You're trying to move an artillery piece that weighs hundreds and hundreds of pounds over ground that has been turned into mush. That is just soft garbage from constant pounding by artillery. Plus there was shell craters everywhere, so it created huge havoc for the artillery, and they lost a huge amount of their light artillery in the early raids that were done. Don't know if I mentioned this, the light artillery battery had 4 artillery pieces each. As the war went on, these artillery pieces were replaced by heavier mortars. But there were still artillery batteries that still had the light cannons. As the war went on, especially by 1918, the artillery would be brought up, and it would be right behind the German trenches in concealed positions as much as possible, and used for putting down targeted barrages. The initial thinking was in the initial attacks that were done in 15-16 that the artillery pieces would be used for more of a direct fire role against pillboxes and enemy concentrations and heavy fortifications. That changed back to the indirect fire role by 1918. Now, if they were going in for just a raid, the primary purpose of the raid was to capture prisoners and intelligence. They would get in there, tear up the enemy, capture prisoners, gather as much information and as many maps and stuff as they possibly could from the company headquarters or potentially a battalion headquarters, and would bring that back with them at the end of the raid. They would also capture new weaponry that was not recognized in order to be brought back for technical intelligence. Now, in the 1918 offensive, and I'm sure this happened quite a few other times also, they would send the stormtroops forward to open breaches inside the American or the Allied defenses. So they would push up, they would assault into the trenches, and before the enemy knows it, they're already in there fighting hand to hand. And then they would push their way through, going towards the enemy's rear areas. The stormtroops would keep going through, and immediately behind them would be standard infantry battalions that would push forward and then finish clearing the trench. And then they also would keep pushing into the enemy's rear areas. Now you're probably wondering, how could we adapt something like this for use in the militia? Well, I'll let you know right now, I have an organization that I'm currently working on that I expect I will be able to do a video on tomorrow morning, where we take an organization like this, modify it, and put it in a completely new organization for use by a resistance during the war. But that's what I was able to gather up, and as I said, it took me a long time. Initially, when I started this last summer, all I could find out was the major organizations, the number of companies, the number of batteries and that were in a battalion, and I could not find out any information on how many squads in a platoon or how many platoons in a company or any of that stuff. And I could not find out any real technical information. I could not find out how many troops were in a squad. I couldn't find out their weapons beyond that they carried carbine 98As, and that was all. But apparently other people have been thinking about this subject over the past few months, and they have done some videos on this. Recommendations for you to look at would be Military History Visualized has a very good video on this, which gave me a lot of information. I also looked at the Great War channel, which is a World War I channel. They did a couple videos on stormtroops on the Allied side and also the German side, with the emphasis being on the German side. So you could look up those if you want to find out more. I just pulled from it the information that I thought was pertinent to figure out this organization. Obviously, I have little to no information as to how many personnel were in headquarters or anything like that. Looking over my notes here, things that I missed. The light artillery batteries, each crew was approximately 8 men. And in the flamethrower section, the ones that did have them typically had around 6 flamethrowers in the section. And each flamethrower was a 2-man weapon. One person carried the tank, one person carried the hose and the nozzle, and would spray the flames into the Allied troops. The Germans learned fairly quickly that the flamethrowers came in exceptionally handy when dealing with pillboxes, concrete fortifications that the Allies had built at the front lines, right on the forward trenches. So, if you like the channel, if you want to kick me a few bucks, the Patreon channel is listed up at the top. I post the videos that I put on YouTube over on Patreon also. I post the videos over there for free. If you want to become a patron, sign up. You can kick me $1, $2, $5, whatever you decide. Or you could do a symbolic type of donation where you could donate $3, symbolizing 3%ers. You know, that choice is up to you. The money that is collected through Patreon I use to purchase supplies for the militia unit that I am in. The supplies are primarily expendables, with them mainly being food and medical. I was told I need to start pushing the Patreon channel more. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essayons.